There is an animal alive today that should not exist. Not metaphorically. By every population genetics model available at the time, the math said it was finished. Twice. The first time, humans killed it down to a number so small that recovery was considered statistically impossible. The second time, nature finished what humans started. It came back from both. The scientists who study it still argue about how. Start with what extinction actually means at the biological level, not the cultural version, not the last individual dying. The real threshold is earlier and harder to see. It is called the minimum viable population, the point at which a species loses enough genetic diversity that even if individuals survive, the population can no longer adapt. Inbreeding accumulates, immune systems narrow, reproductive success drops. The species continues existing for a generation or two while the genetic machinery quietly fails. Biologists call this the extinction debt. The animal is alive. It is already gone. The number varies by species. For large mammals, most models place the minimum viable population somewhere between 500 and 5,000 individuals, depending on generation, time, and habitat stability. Below that threshold, the math stops working in your favor. The Przewalski's horse dropped to 12 individual animals. The entire surviving population of a species that had roamed Central Asia for tens of thousands of years, reduced to 12 horses held in European zoos by 1945. The wild population was already gone. Hunting, habitat loss, competition with livestock had eliminated every free-living individual. What remained was a handful of animals in captivity, genetically isolated, reproductively managed by institutions that had no coordinated plan and limited understanding of what they were holding. The genetics of that moment were catastrophic in ways that took decades to fully measure. When researchers later sequenced the Przewalski's horse genome and compared it to the founding captive population, they found the entire modern population traces back to 14 individuals, not 12. 2 additional animals, a Mongolian domestic horse mare and a single wild-caught stallion, had been added to the captive group in the early 20th century before the population collapsed completely. Those 2 animals are the reason the species has any genetic variation at all. 14 founders. Every Przewalski's horse alive today descends from those 14 animals. The breeding program that followed was not elegant. It was improvised across multiple continents by institutions that communicated slowly and sometimes not at all. Stud books were kept by hand. Genetic records were incomplete. Some breeding pairs were selected for temperament or availability rather than genetic diversity. The population grew, but the diversity problem deepened with every generation of closely related animals producing offspring. By the 1990s, there were over 1,500 Przewalski's horses in captivity. The number looked like success. The genetics told a different story. Researchers analyzing the population found severe inbreeding coefficients, markers of immune system narrowing, and reproductive rates that were declining rather than stabilizing. The species had survived the first extinction event. It was moving toward a second one, this time from the inside. The reintroduction programs that began in Mongolia and China in the 1990s were not primarily about releasing horses into the wild. They were genetic interventions disguised as conservation efforts. Which animals went back, when, and in what combination was calculated to maximize the diversity of the founding wild population. Researchers used pedigree analysis and early genomic tools to identify which captive individuals carried the rarest genetic variants. Those animals went first. The Mongolian steppe does not forgive errors in judgment. The reintroduced horses faced wolves, extreme winter conditions called zoods, competition for water sources, and diseases their immune systems had never encountered. The first cohorts suffered significant losses. Some reintroduction sites lost more than half their animals in the first 3 years, and then something happened that the models had not predicted cleanly. The survivors bred faster than expected. Not all of them. The animals that made it through the first winters were, by definition, the ones whose immune systems had held, whose behavioral repertoire had been adequate, whose bodies had managed the caloric math of a Mongolian winter on open steppe. Their offspring carried those traits. The population that emerged from the early die-off was harder than the one that had gone in. This is the part of the story that population geneticists find most interesting and most difficult to communicate cleanly. The conventional model of small population recovery assumes the primary challenge is preserving genetic diversity. Get enough variance into the founding population, minimize further loss, let the numbers grow. What the Przewalski's horse showed was that natural selection operates even in critically small populations, and it operates fast. Faster than the models assumed. A 2018 genomic study published in Current Biology sequenced the genomes of historical Przewalski's horses from museum specimens alongside modern wild and captive individuals. The findings reframed the entire recovery narrative. The modern wild population, descended from reintroduced captive animals, showed genetic signatures consistent with rapid adaptation to steppe conditions. Specific variants associated with metabolism, immune response, and cardiovascular function had increased in frequency within a handful of generations. The horses were not just surviving, they were changing. The study also confirmed something that had been debated for decades. The Przewalski's horse is not, technically, the ancestor of the domestic horse. Earlier genetic models had suggested a direct lineage. The 2018 data showed the relationship is lateral. Przewalski's horses and domestic horses share a common ancestor but diverged before domestication. The animal humans saved from extinction is the last surviving representative of a wild horse lineage that predates the entire history of human horsemanship. It is not a wild version of something we tamed. It is something we almost destroyed before we understood what it was. The current wild population in Mongolia, China, and reintroduction sites in Kazakhstan and Hungary stands at approximately 2,000 individuals. The International Union for Conservation of Nature reclassified the species from extinct in the wild to endangered in 2008, in 2011 to critically endangered. In 2021, after continued population growth and successful breeding in multiple wild sites, the classification moved again. Endangered, still precarious, no longer the wrong side of the viable threshold. The number that matters most is not the total population. It is the effective population size, the number of individuals actually contributing genetic diversity to the next generation. For the Przewalski's horse, that number remains dangerously low. Researchers monitoring the Mongolian population have documented strong male dominance hierarchies that concentrate reproduction in a small number of dominant stallions. A population of several hundred animals may have an effective breeding population of fewer than 100. The diversity problem has not been solved. It has been slowed. Conservation geneticists managing the recovery have begun incorporating tools that did not exist when the program started. Cryopreserved genetic material from deceased founder animals is being reintroduced through assisted reproduction. Frozen sperm and tissue samples from individuals who died decades ago carry genetic variants that have been lost from the living population. Researchers are, in effect, reaching back in time to retrieve diversity the breeding program inadvertently discarded. In 2020, a Przewalski's horse was born at a San Diego wildlife facility from cells frozen in 1980. The cells belonged to a stallion named Kurt, a founding captive individual whose genetic line had died out in the intervening decades. Kurt's clone, named Kurt, after his genetic source, carries variants that have been absent from the living population for 40 years. Whether those variants confer any adaptive advantage in the current environment is unknown. The experiment is ongoing. The honest account of how the Przewalski's horse survived is not a clean story. It is a story of improvised decisions made with incomplete information, of breeding programs that created new problems while solving old ones, of a species that cooperated with its own recovery in ways the models did not anticipate and may not fully explain. It is a story in which the answer to how did it survive sits somewhere between deliberate human intervention and something the horses did themselves in those first brutal Mongolian winters when the ones that could make it did and the ones that couldn't didn't, and the population that emerged was something the captive program had not quite intended to build. The math said it was finished. Twice the math was wrong. What the data cannot reach is why. Whether the species that walks the Mongolian steppe today survived because of what humans did, or despite it, or because of something encoded in those 14 founders that no model had thought to measure. The horses don't answer. They are too busy surviving.